Hello everyone, and welcome to another one of our Avatar Bible studies. Today we are in Book 2, Episode 15, The Tales of Ba Sing Se, one I'm sure you have been looking forward to for a long time, or at least I have. If you can turn to the book of 1 John is the book, chapter 2 and verse 3, we're going to be discussing what it means to be a follower of Jesus. If that interests you, then feel free to join us. John, the apostle, is making the following observation about Jesus Christ and what it means to be a follower of him. Now by this we know that we know him, if we keep his commandments. He who says, I know him, and does not keep his commandments, is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, truly the love of God is perfected in him. By this we know that we are in him. He who says he abides in him ought himself also to walk just as he walked. So there's a moral imperative. If you claim to be a follower, you should be following. That's the idea. Now, the person who describes themselves as a Christian is making the claim about the way they are living their lives. Originally, this was a statement that wasn't applied to the early Christians, but it was adopted very early on in the Church of Antioch. People were referring to themselves as little Christs, and this caught on because it was entirely accurate. The idea of being Christ-like is, by definition, what it means to be a Christian, a follower of Jesus. And also note that if you don't act in any way, even remotely like Jesus, or don't take anything that he said about life seriously, then you might want to reconsider what you call yourself. But the point being made is this. In today's episode, we saw similar personalities being showcased in all of their glory. And in order to take away more from this episode than feels, of which there were plenty, I want to point to some things that will hopefully make this commandment John is talking about clear. So, starting with Toff and Katara, we were given the opportunity to see their personalities showcased quite nicely. Now, if I were to call myself a Kataraite, or a follower of Toff, what would that look like? Well, to name a few examples, if I were a bender, I would be really good at it. Get two fine examples of just that. I wouldn't like people touching my feet. I wouldn't like people, I wouldn't take kindly to bullies. I would go out of my way to be as pleasant a person as possible until it was no longer dependent on me, and so forth. That was how that would look. So I would, in a sense, reflect their character as it was demonstrated. Now, the Bible agrees especially with the sentiment that Toff made regarding this not being that important, or at least not the most important thing. There was a historical example of a king of Israel being chosen to succeed the first. That was King Saul. And normally this would have fallen in line with Jonathan, Saul's firstborn son. But after, like most politicians, power turned him into a monster, God specifically said, no, this isn't a nation, this is my nation. You're going to choose the king that I pick for you. So the prophet Samuel went to the town which God specified for him and said, find the family of Jesse. Now Jesse had plenty of sons, and the oldest looked really handsome, really tall, really strong, all the sort of things that people in the Middle East wanted out of a king. But much like with Toff, appearances were deceiving. He was corrected by God in 1 Samuel 16 and verse 7. The Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or his physical stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So this emphasis of being as much a decent person on the inside as the outside certainly was an important picture. Yes, Toff can be prettied up when she wants to be, and yes, Katara is pretty, but what makes them both good people is the same observation the Bible makes. It's more important about who you are, not what you look like, and the New Testament agrees with this as well. Second, Zuko. If I were to call myself a follower of Zuko, what would that look like? Well, I'd be a normal teenager, albeit a little unstable and traumatized, but the sort of things expected from someone my age. To narrow things down, I'd pay careful attention to the fact that Zuko wasn't public about his identity as the Prince of the Fire Nation. given how poorly that it would be received in a nation that is not at war with them. We'll call back to the previous episode. I'd be loyal to my girlfriend Mai back at home. I would even humor those around me if I found the whole matter embarrassing or not. And likewise, there is a time in Jesus' life where this similar scenario, not obviously a date, but a parental figure made a request of him that he didn't deem it necessary for why he was there, but it ultimately was used to show what kind of person we were dealing with. So what was that? Well, in the book of John, remember, not 1 John, but John, chapter 2 and verse 1, there was the first recorded miracle Jesus performed, not in necessarily the Lord's timing, but for the Lord's purpose, that it was to show who Jesus actually was. On verse 1 of John 2, it says, "On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there." So note the comparison with Uncle Iro. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding, so we're given a time frame. This is after Jesus had been baptized by John the Baptist and the 40 days in the wilderness, but before he had been giving the Sermon on the Mount and performing miracles, explaining to people exactly who he was and why he was there. But, of course, he is still rolling with a posse, so we get that much. When they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Understand, he's not being disrespectful. He's making the point that, "Mom, I'm not here to cater weddings. I'm here to accomplish something specific." But his mother, knowing her son well enough, said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." So, both Zuko and Jesus are humoring them. Now, there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. So these are hefty jars that were essentially used for plumbing. They would be used for ritual washing and, of course, preparation for meals. Not exactly kosher, if you want to use the word, for drinking. But with that being said, there is no wine in these vessels. This is water. And there is, by the way, no means that Jesus would have to swap out the materials. This is something supernatural. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some out now and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it. And when the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine and did not know where it came from, but the servants who drew the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now." This is the beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So understand the purpose of this. It was, and keep in mind as well, Zuko's date. Was a relationship being formed here? No. For Jesus, was a miracle being used to prove who he was? No. He didn't take any credit for this. The bridegroom and the master of the feast, the caterer, didn't know where this had come from, and the only people who recognized this was Jesus' doing were his disciples and the people who were guilty by association, the ones who brought the water to them. But what happened? Well, much like with Zuko's demonstration of his firebending abilities, it was under wraps, but it still showed who he was, a decent person. Good man at heart, definitely with a strange upbringing and an even stranger family, but nonetheless, we see Zuko's personality being built upon. In the same way, this introduction of Jesus as someone far more significant than just another traveling rabbi. He's creating not just wine, but the sort of wine where a guy who had definitely had some before this encounter said, "Now this is good stuff. Where did you get it?" And the people who are running the plumbing are like, "I don't know what they're going to bathe with now." We're seeing someone here who is far more significant than it leads on, and the same we saw with Zuko. But the point being made is just that. If I were to model myself after Zuko, I'd see some parallels in the character of Jesus. And that's definitely a good example to follow. Continuing on with Aang, if I were to call myself a follower of Aang, what would that look like? Well, given his antics today in the creation of the zoo of Ba Sing Se, or the new zoo at least, if I saw lost or suffering animals, I do everything in my power to help them as if they were people. Now, the Bible agrees that valuing life as a rule, including but not limited to animals, is a trait that you would have in common with God. In Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 10, a point of contrast is made, the lesser to the greater, the righteous to the wicked. It says, the righteous man regards the life of his animal, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. So note the comparison. If someone regards lives of animals, lesser life, quote unquote, right? Well, that person is described as in a right relationship with God. But the person who doesn't, who would be compared to that kind of individual, the tender mercies of the wicked. So even when a wicked person tries to be merciful, it comes across as cruel. And that's the point that we can understand as well. If you understand the relationship you have with God and the character of which you're trying to follow, it's going to affect the way you see everything, not just specific things in specific places. And this is a good takeaway as well. If the things you learn at church don't affect the way you act at home, you're wasting a Sunday and hopefully a Wednesday. But you get the point. Sokka. If I were to call myself a follower of Sokka, what would that look like? Well, I'd do my best to be the best at whatever was expected of me whenever it was expected of me. Paul the Apostle had this same mindset when it came to telling people about Jesus. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 19, he made the observation regarding his evangelist style. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law. And note, Paul didn't say, well, I became a criminal so I could get in with them. No, he said, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ. That I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that by all means I might save some. So the point being made is just that. If Paul was sharing the gospel with a haiku poetry class, he would be the best haiku poet that he could and would try to communicate that in that way. But understand as well, like Sokka's very adaptable personality, Paul's adaptable style is certainly also modeled. I want to win the favor of as many people as possible, not just to showcase my own personality, but to explain people the character of God. That's something we could do well to learn about as well. We don't share the gospel by walking up to people and saying, do you know that your sins are leading you to an eternal state of separation from the Almighty? I can't spell that, let alone explain it to someone in under 20 seconds. But if on the other hand you ask, how are you doing today? Hey, your t-shirt, I like that franchise. What's your name? Oh, that's a very nice name. Are you having a good day today? Is there anything I can talk with you about? Can I perhaps offer you something? Understand the difference. We want to become all things to all people, not showcase ourselves, but be the kind of selves that others would want to be friends with. And nothing would be further from the truth with Sokka. Momo. If I were to be a follower of Momo, what would that look like? Well, given the circumstances he went through in today's antics, if I were in a difficult situation and able to get out of it, I'd do the same if I saw others in the same predicament. Jesus taught the same in Matthew 7 and verse 12. Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. The law referring to the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and the prophets, everything else, the writings of those who were spokesmen of God. You want to obey the Old Testament commands? Treat others the way you would want to be treated. Now, you say, oh, well, I hate myself, so I should hate people? No. And by the way, people who say they hate themselves, they don't actually mean it, because usually this comes from people who are saying, oh, I'm so ugly, I hate myself. No, if you actually hated yourself, you'd be glad you were ugly. You never see someone you hate and say, man, I really pity that person for looking so unattractive. No, you'd celebrate it, right? Oh, man, I hate that person. Look at them, they're so ugly. Well, on the other hand, I were to say, if I were locked in a cage and able to get out, the Christian thing to do, following the character of God, would also be in wanting to free those who are in the same situation. I care about more people's circumstances than this person. Now, the moment you've all been waiting for, Iroh. If I were to call myself a follower of Iroh, what would that look like? Well, given what we saw in today's episode, I would act like Jesus. Now, if I were to call myself a follower of Jesus, what would that look like? Let's go through a few examples. I'd be gentle without being a pushover. I'd be a blessing without being taken advantage of. I'd be kind without compromising truth, and I'd seek the redemption of the irredeemable. In a word, I'd be like God. In Isaiah 42 and verse 1, we read a description of Jesus 800 years before he was born. Behold, my servant whom I uphold, my elect one in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people. He will not cry out, nor raise his voice, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. Now, this doesn't mean that he was against singing. It means that he would not be a boisterous or a brawling kind of individual. A bruised reed he will not break, and smoking flax he will not quench. So the idea of a bruised reed, the idea of those little sticks, those prokaryotic organisms that if you bend them or if they end up affected by the weather in any way, they're basically a lost cause. Most people would just break them off and put them into the water for the fish to eat. But Jesus wasn't that kind of person. He would see someone hurt and seek their healing, not to just put them out of their misery. And a smoking flax, to keep the theme of the firebender, he would see sparks, cinders, or ashes that people would usually look at and go, oh, I better put sand on that so it doesn't, just continue to molder there without serving any purpose. Jesus would be the kind of person to stoop down, see those sparks, and say, no, you can do it. Come on, let's get that fire going again. That's the idea. So a very encouraging person at that, especially towards those considered to be lost causes. He will bring forth justice for truth. He will not fail nor be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands shall wait for his law. So his authority would spread not just to Israel, but beyond it, the coastlands as well. And Jesus made the same description of himself in very much the same words we described with Iroh. He who sent me is with me. This is John 8:29. The Father has not left me alone, for I always do those things that please him. Now, think about this for a second. When you see Jesus, what kind of person do you picture? Do you see the well-dressed and devout cardinals giving edicts from its towers, or do you see someone comforting an upset child and giving a break to a flustered mom? If you see Jesus getting mugged on the street, can you picture him as the kind of person that would not only be able to take care of himself, but even more so would sit down and talk with the person, maybe give them the opportunity to start a new life, to seek the redemption of the sinner? If you saw him weeping the side of a grave, as we read in Isaiah 53, a man of sorrows and well acquainted with grief, someone with understanding and experience of the human life. Well, I read Hebrews. We do not have a great high priest who cannot empathize with our weaknesses, but was in all ways tempted as we are, yet without sin. I'm seeing a lot of Jesus in this, don't you? And that's the point. So tying this all back together, what does it mean to be a Christian? John said it was to keep his commandments. What are his commandments? Well, Jesus gave this statement in John 15 and verse 12. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. That's the example we're called to follow. If we want to call ourselves Christian, that's how we do it. Thank you for your time in listening to this study. If you have any sincere questions or want to know more about the topics discussed in today's episode, please leave them in the comments below. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go. But most importantly, if you know someone who would be blessed by this message, perhaps familiar with Avatar but not these biblical themes, Please share it with someone you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time. Remember that Jesus loves you, and that when we saw him as a person, and I'll finish with this, we saw someone far more significant than just a good moral teacher. We saw someone whose name echoes throughout the ages. And I just want to finish with this. This is the poem One Solitary Life by Dr. James Allen Francis. He was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in an obscure village where he worked in a carpenter's shop until he was 30, when the public opinion turned against him. He never wrote a book, never held an office, never went to college, never visited a big city. He never traveled more than 200 miles from the place he was born. He did none of the things usually associated with greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies. He went through a mockery of a trial, then nailed to a cross between two thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his clothing. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 19 centuries have come and gone today, and Jesus is the central figure of the human race and the leader of mankind's progress. All the armies that have ever marched, and all the navies that have ever sailed, all the parliaments that have ever sat, and all the kings that have ever reigned, have not affected the life of mankind on earth as powerfully as that one solitary life. God bless you, and I look forward to talking to you all again about these things next time.